Okay. So we're going to share screen now. And we're going to share Rivers of Maryland. Eastern Shore. Okay. I'm going to put this up here. To do slideshow from beginning. Okay, so this week's class is we are going to be visiting the Eastern Shore, one of my favorite places in Maryland to visit. If you're not familiar with it, I recommend that you go there and look around. And we are going to look at this map again. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, before we start Rivers of the Eastern Shore, there were some questions last week, and here are the answers that I found. One question was, is the daily water flow in the Potomac the same as the Susquehanna? And the answer is no. Obviously, you can see from this it is not. When they measure this, the daily flow of the Susquehanna is about 3 times the Potomac. And as we'll be talking about when we discuss the Susquehanna, it is responsible for about half of the water inflow of the bay. So the Potomac is just one of many other rivers that contribute the other half of the freshwater inflow. Also, question was, what is discharging heated water into a river or other water body considered pollution? And the answer is it certainly is. And it is called thermal pollution. Heating the water up or discharging water that's colder than the temperature of the river is also thermal pollution. And that affects the life in the river, the plant and animal life. So it is considered pollution and it should be treated. The other thing I wanted to point out is the book by Tom Pelton that somebody mentioned is actually called The Chesapeake in Focus. And apparently, I have not seen the book, but apparently it's a very good and comprehensive book about the bay and its problems. So the Eastern Shore, this is part of, as we talked about in the geology of the state, it is part of the Coastal Plain Province, which is the easternmost part of the state. And it is, I'm trying to get my cursor here. I can't seem to do it. Anyway, if you look at the map, the bay goes up the middle and the coastal plain is on both sides of the bay, but the part that is labeled Delmarva Peninsula section is the Eastern Shore. And it adjoins Delaware, which is to the right of what's shown on the map. And that is all part of the Delmarva Peninsula. So the coastal plain is relatively flat. It has sandy loam soils, for the most part, which are good for agriculture. There's a lot of agriculture. And if you drive around the Eastern Shore, you will see a lot of farms. The rivers of the Eastern Shore are relatively wide and deep and closely spaced together. They flow into the bay and they are navigable for considerable distances in from the bay. So they played an important part in transportation in this region with safe and relatively fast boat trips. It was possible to settle the interior of the Eastern Shore. And these rivers and the boats that plied them served the Eastern Shore right up until the building of the Bay Bridge, which was in 1952. So that was until the middle of the 20th century, not that long ago. The geology and the topography here made it suitable for growing tobacco. It was, as I said before, it was a cash crop. It had a ready market in Europe and other places. And typically it would be grown on a large plantation that had its own piers on the river. And because of this, it took a while before port towns started growing up in the earliest days of settlement. They weren't needed because the plantation owners shipped their goods out directly from their own piers. The Eastern Shore was an important and influential part of Maryland and its politics for quite a while. I found this quote in an older book about the Eastern Shore, quote, "It is the rule in Maryland that one of the two senators must be an Eastern Shore man," well, unquote. Obviously, this no longer applies. Maryland's two senators are neither of them from the Eastern Shore. And sometimes our senators are not even a man, as one of our recently retired senators, Barbara Mikulski, and neither is she from the Eastern Shore. So the rivers, as I said, are all navigable in their lower courses. The Choptank and the Miles River can accommodate large ships at least 20 miles inland. As the Wacomico is not as deep, but it can accommodate scows and tugboats. And the Pocomoke is also a large and deep river, which is navigable for quite a ways inland. So towns would develop at the head of navigation, the point at which the river becomes too shallow for ocean-going ships. Some of the towns on the Eastern Shore that were head of navigation are Snow Hill on the Pocomoke, Salisbury on the Wicomico, Princess Anne on the Manikin, Greensboro on the Choptank, and Easton on the Tread Avon, and Millington on the Chester. And some of these towns are no longer on navigable waters because the rivers have silted up in their immediate area. River transportation included passenger sailboats. They were packet sloops. And we'll look at some of these in detail a little further on. And the longest river on the Delmarva Peninsula is the Choptank, which is 71 miles long and with its headwaters in Delaware. And some of the rivers are very short. They're basically just tidal inlets and a few miles long. So we're going to look at the rivers. We're going to go from south to north and look especially at the largest ones. Here is a map of the rivers of the southern Eastern Shore, and you can see how many rivers there are and how close together they are. And some of the...
You did not forget to record the meeting?
I did. No. Sorry. Some of the major rivers on the Eastern Shore are the Pocomoke, which is the southernmost. I am not having any luck getting my cursor here, so I can't point things out. I'm sorry. The Pocomoke, the Wicomico, there's the Little Anamessex and the Big Anamessex, the Nanticoke, the Manikin, and the Choptank. And the Choptank at the northernmost part of this map is usually considered the boundary between the southern Eastern Shore and the northern Eastern Shore. And as you may have noticed from reading these river names, that they are mostly Native American names. The northern Eastern Shore, interestingly, these are much less Native Americans. There's the Choptank again at the southern end of this map, dividing the southern and northern parts of the shore. But then we have the Tread Avon, the Wye and Miles, the Corsica, the Chester, which is named for a city in England, the Sassafras, that probably is a Native American word, the Bohemia, the Elk near Elkton, and the Northeast. There's also the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, which is number 8 on this map. And we'll be talking about that, which is it's an artificial river, but works like a river, and turns out it's a very important waterway. And up and down the whole eastern shore, as you see by looking at this map, there are many creeks, inlets, sounds, and other bodies of water. So with all this water access, boats, excuse me, have been and still are a way of life on the eastern shore. There were all kinds of boats developed for the conditions of the eastern shore. They had to be very maneuverable, shallow draft, and suited to the narrow inlets and shallow waters of the bay and the rivers that were its tributaries. They were the working equipment of the watermen, which is someone who makes their living on the water. They harvest crabs, oysters, and fish. They are a diminishing group in Maryland. There used to be many more of them. There were fewer resources and possibly easier work elsewhere. But the ones that are still around mostly live on the eastern shore. And this is a model of one of the earliest of the eastern shore types of boats, the log canoe. And the Europeans adapted this from the way the Native Americans built their boats. They would take a hollowed out log, and then the European settlers added a sail to it. It was simple and cheap, and people still build them as a hobby, and they race them. And this is a picture of log canoe races taking place somewhere on the eastern shore. During the 19th century, there was an increasing demand for the oysters of the Chesapeake and its rivers. And that led to the development of larger and faster boats that could work further from shore and in all kinds of weather. And a number of different types of boats were developed for both oystering and carrying freight. And this is one of them. This is called a bug-eye, and this is the Edna E. Lockwood. This is a 2-masted schooner, and it was used for oystering in shallow waters. And this is the last working oyster boat of its kind. It was built in 1889 at Tillman Island on the eastern shore. It worked for at least 7 sets of owners until 1967. And it's now at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum in St. Michael's, where you can go and look at it. This is another type of oyster boat. It's bigger. It's called a pungy, or sometimes spelled P-O-N-G-E-E, Pongy. And this is the Lady Maryland. It was larger than the bug-eye, and it had topmasts that were used for dredging oysters. And it could actually sail out on the ocean. But it was the draft was too deep to maneuver over oyster beds in shallow waters. So it was one of the freight boats that were the workhorses of the eastern shore. It was typically painted green and pink, and according to Wikipedia, nobody knows why, but it was, and this is. So this is a replica, the Lady Maryland, which was built for the Living Classroom Foundations, which operates out of Baltimore Harbor. There was the Skipjack. This is a single-mast oystering boat. It was used for dredging oysters off the floor of the bay and its tidal rivers. And this is the official state boat of Maryland. The Rebecca T. Ruark was built in 1886, and it is available for 2-hour trips off Tillman Island. Another skipjack, the Stanley Morgan, is owned by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and they run 2.5-hour trips out of Annapolis. We took one of those, and it was a lot of fun. They tell you all about the bay and it's, the oystering and so on. So I don't know if they're still doing it right now, but if the trips are resumed, I would recommend that. And this is called a Dead Rise workboat. It's a simple design. They were between 16 and 30 feet long. And it was a general all-purpose boat used for crabbing, fishing, and oystering. And then there were the oystering middlemen. These were called buy boats. They are boats that would meet the oyster boats and buy their catch and then bring it to a port like Crisfield or Baltimore to sell. So they made it possible for the watermen actually working the oyster beds to stay out there and keep harvesting instead of having to go back and forth to sell their catch. There were also boats that carried passengers between towns on the Eastern Shore and also between the towns and Baltimore. And in the days of sail, this is kind of what one would look like. This is an ad from 1793. You can see the date on the bottom, dated Chestertown. And this was a packet boat, meaning a boat that had a regular schedule. And it left Chestertown, if you read down to the bottom of the first paragraph, every Monday at 9 o'clock. And it would presumably get to Baltimore sometime Wednesday and then leave back for Chestertown Thursday at 9 o'clock and presumably get there Saturday, assuming it was a 3-day trip, Monday to Wednesday, Thursday to Saturday. And they probably took Sunday off. And it says the master of the said boat will use all possible diligence to accommodate passengers and be careful to execute with punctuality every trust committed to his charge. So this was, even then, they were trying to get people by telling you what a good job they were doing. And after the days of sail, the packet boats were replaced by steamboats. This is one of the ones from the old Bay Line, which went up and down the bay from Baltimore to Norfolk, actually. Obviously, they put the sailing packets out of business. And they carried both passengers and freight between the Eastern Shore and Baltimore. And again, they took about, they ran until the 1950s, again, when the Bay Bridge was built. And it took about 24 hours to go to the Eastern Shore from Baltimore, which was faster than 3 days. We'll be looking at steamboats again when we talk about the Patuxent River, but there were steamboats up and down the major rivers, all the major rivers of the Eastern Shore and some of the other rivers in Maryland. But then again, as I said, the Bay Bridge came along in 1952. You no longer needed a boat to go to the Eastern Shore, although I guess you could have always gone around through Cecil County. But people took the boats a great deal. But the Bay Bridge put all the steamboats out of business. Another important kind of boat were ferries. Before there were good roads and bridges, as I said before, there were ferries at many of the crossing points of the rivers of the Eastern Shore and also tidal rivers like the Lower Patuxent and the Lower Potomac. And there are 3 river ferries still on the Eastern Shore today. 2 of them crossing the Wicomico. This is one of them at Whitehaven. And the other one is at a place on the Wicomico called Upper Ferry. This is a little further down the river. And then there is the Oxford to Bellevue ferry that we saw before, the Tread Avon River. And this is the schedule for the Whitehaven ferries. And they came up with this slogan, "You believe in ferries." Both of the one at Whitehaven and the one at Upper Ferry are operated by Wicomico County. So they're kind of promoting this as part of the tourism. You see it at the bottom of this poster, it says, explore Wicomico County. And they're very short trips. The Wicomico at this point is not very wide, but they're still operating and they carry cars. So now we're going to look at some of the largest rivers on the Eastern Shore, starting at the southernmost one, the Pocomoke, and working our way north. And at this point, I'll stop. And Mary Lee, any questions?
No questions.
Okay.
Can I ask one?
Yeah, sure.
That ferry in Wicomico, I can't orient myself without a map, but what would you do if you took that ferry? What kind of activities would you do? And that would take you.
Well, it would be.
How do you get to Wicomico? Well, where does it go?
Okay. If you're going from north to south, you would be heading towards Salisbury, which is the county seat of Wicomico. And
Okay.
there's a lot going on in Salisbury, which I'll talk about in a few minutes.
Okay.
So if,
All right.
but you know, there are roads that cross the river nearby. You don't have to take the ferries. I think it's just kind of a fun thing to do.
Yeah.
Actually, but,
Thank you.
yeah. So the Pocomoke, this is a fairly narrow river, but it's deep, and its waters are dark, sometimes described as black. And this is because there are cypress trees that grow in the river. The headwaters are in Delaware, and in Maryland, it is the boundary upstream between Wicomico and Worcester County. Then it flows through Worcester County, which is the southernmost county on the Eastern Shore. And it empties in the bay at Pocomoke Sound, which is on the Virginia line. And as I said before, the head of navigation is Snow Hill, which is also the county seat of Worcester County. This is Pocomoke City, which was a fairly important deep water port at one time. It's downriver from Snow Hill, and it has a bridge across the river. And this is a drawbridge, and you can see in one picture on the left, the drawbridge is closed, and on the other, it is in the process of opening or maybe closing. So this is a common type of bridge found on the Eastern Shore rivers, the tidal rivers, because they had to accommodate boats traveling to communities upstream. And the only way to avoid this is to build a bridge that is high enough over the river that boats can go under it. And that's a very difficult and expensive proposition. We'll see one of those in a little bit. A river called the Little Anamessex went to Crisfield. This is the old custom house in Crisfield, which was a major port. It's really just a long tidal inlet. It's not very long, but it provided Crisfield with a deep water port. And Crisfield was once known as the seafood capital of the world. Before 1868, when a railroad was built, seafood had to be shipped out by boat. So it all came into Crisfield and then went out of Crisfield. In 1868, the Pennsylvania Railroad extended a line to the city. So then you could ship oysters and other seafood directly from Crisfield to Philadelphia and other northern cities. So it no longer had to be taken to Baltimore by boat and then offloaded onto a train. And at that point, their seafood business expanded dramatically. And they built a new port using oyster shells for fill. And it was a boom town, and it was known as the city built on oyster shells. And this is a crab picking house, picking and packing. These are crab pickers. In the late 19th and early 20th century, there were many packing houses for oysters and crabs. It was a major center of employment. This picture was taken in 1940 at a company called the Melbourne Oyster Company, which described itself as Maryland's most modern crab meat producing plant. But you can see from this picture what a lot of handwork cooking crabs requires. And you pick crabs in the summer and shucked oysters in the winter. And then they were shipped by train and by steamboat all over the East Coast. Crisfield, and you can see actually from this picture that this was a major employment source for the African-American people on the Eastern Shore. But it was hard and messy work. In 1904, Crisfield was the second largest city in Maryland after Baltimore. They also had canneries for vegetables that were grown on the Eastern Shore. I came across a statistic, I couldn't find the exact date, but it was in the early 1900s. Crisfield shipped out 29 train carloads of fish and 60,000 gallons of oysters. So this was a major industry. Well, the packing houses are mostly gone now, and oyster populations have declined severely. The crab population has declined, but not as steeply, and they're still harvested. And instead of the seafood capital of the world, Crisfield now calls itself the crab capital of the world. And of course, this is the iconic Maryland blue crab. So the other major export, of course, was oysters in the days when there were major oyster harvests in the bay and its rivers. And this is a picture of an oyster reef and a diagram of how an oyster reef works. The oysters deposit themselves on the top, and eventually they die off, and then you have a substrate that is empty shells, which eventually erodes, but the top of the reef are the live oysters that are harvested. The reefs are found in both the bay and its tidal rivers. Oysters need a certain level of salinity or saltiness. And so they are found in the lower bay and its tidal rivers. Salinity is measured in parts per thousand. The ocean is 35 parts per thousand, and the minimum salinity for oysters is 8 parts per thousand. And by the time you get up to the northern part of the bay, north of Baltimore, there's almost no salinity at all. So during colonial times, oysters were a staple. They weren't a delicacy like they are now, and they weren't a commodity the way they were later on. They were harvested when needed by using tongs. But by the second half of the 19th century, oystering had become a major industry, and they were being shipped out all over the East Coast. And they started using dredges to harvest them in larger quantities than you could get with hand tongs. And of course, there was a network of railroads to take them all over the East Coast. And there started to be a lot of fights about oystering and who got to use which oyster beds, fighting over what they considered their turf. There were so-called oyster pirates, and pitched battles took place between boats of oystermen. This led in 1868 in Maryland to the creation of something called the Oyster Navy. And that was to enforce oyster harvesting laws that by that time the state had adopted. But it took a very long time before this kind of law enforcement became effective. The successor to the Oyster Navy, well, somebody's not muted. Debbie, can you mute yourself? Can you hear me? The successor to the Oyster Navy was the Natural Resources Police of the Department of Natural Resources. And now what they were busy doing is looking for people harvesting undersized oysters among their other duties. And they find them. So by the turn of the 20th century, the oyster stocks in the bay were starting to decline, and it became easier to enforce the laws. Today, the level of oysters are at historic lows, and the state is doing various things to try and bring them back. There are oyster diseases, and of course, overharvesting that was a major part of the problem. And they are trying to create special environments for growing oysters on the river bottoms called oyster bars. There are two methods that are being tried. In Maryland, they're trying something called sanctuaries, which keeps some oyster areas off limits to harvesting to allow the larger oysters to reproduce. In Virginia, which of course is the southern part of the bay and also has its oyster industry, they're doing rotational harvesting, in which they open and close oyster bars to harvesting in a multi-year rotation to allow the beds to recover. And there is a program in Maryland called Marylanders Grow Oysters. We started it in 2008. And this is how it works. If you live along one of the tidal rivers or creeks of the Eastern Shore or Southern Maryland, you can volunteer for this. The DNR will bring you cages with baby oysters. They're called spat. They're tiny little things, and lower the cages into the water along your property. And your job is to make sure they're not disturbed, and occasionally you clean debris off the cage. About a year later, DNR retrieves the cage, and if all goes well by then, you will have a colony of year-old oysters. And they will have a good survival rate when they are transplanted onto the artificial oyster bars. In a recent year, the program had about 5,000 people participating and about 7,500 cages. So these are different pictures that were taken of people participating in Marylanders Grow Oysters, including in the lower right-hand corner, a picture labeled Young Citizen Volunteers. And you can see, I guess the 10-month-old oysters are, that's about when they would be taken out and put into the oyster bars. So now we will move on up the bay, up the Eastern Shore, to the Manakin River and Deal Island. Princess Anne, the county seat of Somerset County, was once the head of navigation of the Manakin, but again, the Manakin eventually silted up and you can no longer get to Princess Anne by boat. The entrance to the Manakin is on the south side of Deal Island. The name was originally Devil's Island, then somehow it became Deal's Island, and then Deal Island. Many watermen live there, and every Labor Day weekend, the island has skipjack races. And this is a story about Deal Island. In the 18th century, the southern Eastern Shore became heavily Methodist. There was a religious revival period. And one of the famous preachers who lived toward the end of the century was a gentleman named Brother Joshua Thomas. That's what they called him. He lived from 1776 to 1853 and had a camp meeting on Deal Island. And his ministry was traveling around the lower Eastern Shore in a log canoe. And he would go around preaching and converting people to Methodism. But this story about Joshua Thomas takes place during the War of 1812. And it is in Tangier Sound, which is a body of water that about 25 miles long. It goes from Crisfield all the way up to the Nanticoke on the north. And during the War of 1812, the British fleet was using Tangier Sound as the center of their operations for attacks further up the Chesapeake. Brother Thomas met with the British admiral on several occasions because he had a reputation being a just and holy man. Among other things, he influenced the admiral to spare the trees around the Methodist camp meeting and to use a vacant house as a headquarters rather than seizing a neighbor's house. Then, in the late summer of 1814, the British were preparing to attack Baltimore. But before they left Tangier Sound, they summoned Brother Thomas to preach to the British soldiers. This is a guy obviously trusted by everybody. They had about 12,000 men lined up in columns to hear him. He warned them of the danger and said God had told him that they could not take Baltimore and would not succeed in their battle, which of course is what happened. So Brother Thomas's part in the war may have been small, but he acquired a great reputation after this happened. So that's my Deal Island story. And now we're going up to the Wicomico River. The entrance is at Tangier Sound. This is a picture taken along the river. It is a mile wide at the mouth, and the head of navigation is at Salisbury. Salisbury is the largest city on the Eastern Shore. Its population is about 30,000 people. It's home to the headquarters of Purdue Farms, one of their big employers, which also, by the way, there's a lot of chicken raising on the Eastern Shore, and Purdue Farms is a big contractor with the farmers who raise chickens there. Salisbury has a state university, a community college, a regional hospital, a minor league stadium, the Delmarva Shorebirds, I believe they're an Oriole farm team, a well-known small zoo, and an unusual museum. The museum is the Ward Museum of Wildfowl Art. And these are the Ward brothers, Lem and Steve Ward. They lived in Crisfield. They were brothers. They lived there their entire lives, and they made beautiful wooden duck decoys that were eventually bought by collectors and are in demand all over the world. This is one of theirs that fetched $46,000 recently. And many of them are in the Ward Museum, as well as other paintings and other kinds of art about wildfowl. So because of its deep water river access, shipbuilding has been one of Salisbury's industries. And one of the shipbuilding companies in the city was in the Baltimore Sun recently, and the news was that they had contracted with a maritime transportation company in Baltimore to build 7 new tugboats for them. And they were apparently the first ocean-going tugboats to be built in Maryland in about 50 years. And as we saw before, there are 2 places where you can cross the Wicomico River by ferry, at Whitehaven and Upper Ferry. And again, these ferries are operated by the Wicomico County, and Salisbury is the county seat. Going north, come to the Nanticoke, and this is a map of the Nanticoke River watershed. It goes way up into Delaware. And the mouth of the Nanticoke is also at Tangier Sound. That's down here at the bottom of the map. The head of navigation is the town of Seaford, Delaware. And in the lower reaches of this river, it's over a mile wide, and there are salt marshes on the north side known as the Dorchester Marshes. The south side has more of what's called fast land. Fast land is a legal term as opposed to marshland. It is land you can build on. There are several villages along the southern side of the river. One of them is called Bivalve. It was once a center of oyster shipping, but in 2010, it had a population of 201 people. And For those not familiar with the term bivalve, it is a category of mollusk that has two shells. And bivalves include oysters, clams, and mussels. The Nanticoke is the border between Dorchester County and Wicomico County. Dorchester on the north, well, it's kind of north and west, and Wicomico on the south and east. This river is not as heavily settled as other Eastern Shore rivers. One theory is that the Native Americans in this area, who were the Nanticokes, were more warlike, although I'm not sure why that explains why it was not settled in the 19th century. The main town on the Nanticoke is Vienna, which was once a US port of entry for exports and imports. And the land for the town was bought from the Nanticokes for 5,000 pounds of tobacco. There is a major tributary to the Nanticoke called Marshy Hope Creek, which is navigable up to Federalsburg in Caroline County. There's a lot of recreational fishing and commercial fishing on the Nanticoke. And we're going to look at two species of the marine life in the river. These are, of course, all found in other rivers of the Eastern Shore. And the first one we have seen before, the American eel, Anguilla rostrata. This has a unique life history. I think I might have talked about this before, but it's worth describing again. It's called catadromous, as the opposite of anadromous, like salmon or shad. They spawn in the ocean and then they swim to streams in the Chesapeake Bay area and other areas to mature, and then they go back to the ocean to spawn. It's likely that the eel was abundant in virtually all the estuaries, rivers, streams, and lakes of Maryland and other coastal states before the colonization of North America. The DNR has something called the Maryland Biological Stream Survey, or MBSS, an ongoing survey of freshwater streams in Maryland. And their recent data showed an absence of eels in areas below dams, which makes sense because dams are a barrier to the fish to be able to migrate. But none of the Eastern Shore rivers have been dammed. The topography doesn't work for that. They don't have the kind of waterfalls that you see on the Western Shore. So there are eels on the Eastern Shore. Another important fish is the yellow perch, Perca flavescens. This is the first fish that appears in fishing season in Maryland. They call it the harbinger of spring. It lives in the brackish waters of the lower rivers and bay, and then it swims upstream in the spring to spawn in fresh water. And of course, the spawning runs are a fishing opportunity because there's so many fish all swimming in the same place at the same time. Years ago, they'd have reports on the start of the yellow perch season, or runs, on the weekly fishing report. You could call a number called, that was 247 FISH. But nowadays, you get your fishing report from probably online, but I also read you can ask Alexa for it if you have Alexa. Anyway, the perch runs would start in the southern rivers, and then if you timed it right, you could catch the runs in rivers like the Wicomico and then move north as the fish did as the weather got warmer. And then the final Eastern Shore run would be in Northeast River in Cecil County. But there were legendary perch runs fishing spots all over the Eastern Shore rivers. And there was a commercial perch fishery, which typically harvested 100 to 200,000 pounds a year, which were processed at plants in Perryville and Baltimore. The yellow perch population had declined drastically since the 1970s. Some of the causes were sedimentation of the rivers, chemical runoff, loss of habitat, and overfishing. So then DNR established regulations with limits to both the commercial and recreational catch. But in the 1990s, DNR and the fishing community got together and started to research the habits of the fish and develop a management plan for a sustainable fishery. It was called the Maryland Tidewater Yellow Perch Management Plan. As a result, by 2010, the perch runs had increased to the point that the town of Northeast in Cecil County was able to hold its first annual yellow perch celebration. And DNR is now promoting sales of yellow perch to consumers in Maryland and bolstering the commercial fishing industry. Recently, during yellow perch season, you could buy it at Whole Foods. I'm going to stop now and ask Mary Lee if there's any questions at this point.
Yes, there are
Okay.
comments. There are some comments. Michael Baker said Governor Tawes was from Crisfield. He was the last of the Eastern Shore governors. And then Ted McKeldin, whose father was a governor, he said Governor Hughes came after Governor Tawes and was from Denton in Caroline County.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Also, Fran Cannon said that she has a comment, not a question, but it's not on here.
Oh, well, Fran, you want to unmute yourself? And
Yeah, I already have. Thank you. When you were talking about the ferries going back and forth and the question came up as to what would people get on a ferry for, my mother-in-law used to regularly take the Tolchester boat over to Tolchester just for fun. I'm not sure what she did other than walk around and shop and, just do touristy things, but she did it
oh yeah,
regularly, and she did it for a long time.
yeah. No,
I enjoyed it.
the Tolchester Beach was actually a like an amusement area. People would go
Ah,
to Baltimore for the day
well, that's
as an outing to Tolchester and back. Yeah, and that was
sounds like what she did.
that's what the ferry was. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Yeah, it's Mary Lee, Judy. There also was the quote to Betterton, which I think it might be, it's not too far from Chestertown, but that was another beach. That was another day trip for Baltimore on one of the ferries. So that was another fun
I
thing.
think Betterton is on the Sassafras River. But
Is it on the Sassafras? Okay, I know it was over
I'll have
southern
to check. I think it is. Yeah.
near Chestertown.
Tim Casey has a question. Tim, you want to unmute yourself? Tim?
Yes, thank you, Judy. Really two questions. One is, when you were talking about Crisfield, would you have a date at when it would have been the seafood capital of the world? Well, approximately what time frame? You may have mentioned it, but I missed it.
Well, yeah, the middle of the 19th century, when the railroad, I think it was 1868, the railroad came there, and then they were able to expand, the quantities that they were shipping out. So from then until the oyster populations declined, which was in the early 20th century. So it was the second half of the 19th century.
Okay, thank you. The other question was, I'd seen some statistics on, they use a date, a high point for a measuring date for the number of oysters in the bay, like a percentage, like at this date, we use it as 100%. And then from there forward, they use some percentage of that it has declined. And I've heard declines down in dates in certainly the 21st century, where we are now, of well under 1%. I don't know whether you in your research encountered any information on that.
I have seen something. I'll look into it and come up with what I can find next week. But yeah, and the other thing about oysters that's interesting that I didn't mention is that they filtered the water. So when there were abundant oysters in the bay, they were responsible for helping keep the water clean. And they're no longer there in that, to do that. They've declined so drastically. Mary
One
Lee,
additional point. My sister had a place down off of one of the creeks off of Middle River, and they were actually, she showed me, they had one of those cages there. Now that was well north of the salinity that you would need for oyster. And I think it's north of what you said 8% would be for salinity for oysters, but
eight,
I-
8 parts per thousand. Yeah, it's not 8%. It's 0.8.
8 parts per thousand. Oh, okay. Thank you.
But
Um,
I don't know, and it varies. The salinity depends on how much fresh water is flowing into the bay. So the salinity lines move up and down during, the course of the year. So,
Yeah, I may have not understood what she was doing,
No,
but
I
I thought it was actually going to be for almost like cleaning the bay because they're filters.
no, they're to restore the oyster industry. But
Okay.
it will, if it really, the oysters come back, it will have the effect of helping to clean the bay for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank
Okay,
you.
Mary Lee? do you want-
Judy, there's one more question from Debbie. I think you may just have answered it, though. What causes the salinity to decrease north of Baltimore?
Yeah, it's the fresh water inflow from the Susquehanna, actually. Okay, let's go on, 'cause it's getting late. The Dorchester Marshes on the north side of the Navajo. There are two major marshy areas, which are, one is federal and one is state land. The federal is the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, or NWR, and the state has a Fishing Bay Wildlife Management Area, which is abbreviated as WMA. And these are areas that are preserved by the feds and the state mostly for the benefit of wildlife, but they are open for things like hunting, fishing, and trapping. The Fishing Bay is 29,000 acres. It's the largest parcel of publicly owned tidal wetlands in Maryland. And Blackwater is just a little smaller at 27,000 acres. Blackwater was originally established in 1933. It was as a haven for ducks and geese that migrate along the Atlantic Flyway. And during November, you could see upwards of 35,000 geese and 15,000 ducks migrating, visiting the refuge on their southern migration. Blackwater also has the largest remaining natural population of the Delmarva fox squirrel, which is an endangered species. And it's host to the largest breeding population of bald eagles on the East Coast north of Florida. So this is a very busy area, although you can see bald eagles around Baltimore. The refuge has a visitor center, a wildlife drive, hiking and paddling trails, roads for bicycling, and places for hunting, fishing, and crabbing. The best time to visit here, though, is between late October and early April, because in the warm weather, you have mosquitoes and green flies in great abundance here, and they are very unpleasant. Money for establishing and enlarging federal wildlife refuges come from the annual sale of federal duck hunting stamps. And based from the money from these, there was a recent grant approved of $505,000 to purchase another 112 acres for Blackwater. And now we're going to have a story about the marshes that I call A Tale of Two Rodents. This is the muskrat. This is one of the best known native residents of the marshes on the Eastern Shore. They were trapped for their pelts. They used to take as many as 1 million a year. That's how abundant they were. And stewed muskrat is supposed to be one of the dining delicacies of the Eastern Shore. At an outdoor show held in Dorchester County in the spring, one of the events is a muskrat skinning contest. And in December, the town of Princess Anne rings in the new year by lowering a toy muskrat, Marshall P. Muskrat, at midnight from one of its towers. So that is the Eastern Shore muskrat Ondatra zybithecus. And this is, whoop, the nutria, Iocastor coipo. This is sort of the anti-muskrat, I call it, a non-native rodent, and it had become a major pest of the marshes. They were imported in the late 19th century from South America for their pelts, but when the fur market collapsed in the early 20th century, the breeders released them into the wild, which was a major mistake. They have a very high reproductive rate and no natural enemies. In Louisiana, there were 20 animals that were released, and over 20 years later, there were about 20 million of them. And the problem is that they eat the marsh grasses. They estimated over 5,000 acres of wetland vegetation was destroyed in Maryland, leaving only mud flats, which you can kind of see in this picture. But the federal government and the state DNR got together with a concerted effort to eradicate the nutria. And so far, it seems to have been successful. One of the high-tech devices they did was to trap one, fit it out with a GPS collar, and then follow it to find out where its colonies were. As of 2016, all known nutria populations had been removed from the Delmarva Peninsula, and the marshes are recovering. So this is so far a success story. So going north from the Dorchester Marshes along the lower Nanticoke, we come to the Choptank. And if you've ever driven south on Route 50, you have to go to Ocean City. You have crossed the Choptank. As I said, it's considered the boundary between the southern and the northern eastern shores. The Dorchester County is on the south side and Talbot is on the north side. It's about 71 miles long, the longest of the rivers on the eastern shore. And the largest town along the river on its lower reaches is Cambridge. And that is where Route 50, the road to Ocean City, crosses the river. And the river is about 2 miles wide at this point. So in 1987, the state built a new 4-lane bridge for the Route 50 crossing, but they kept part of the old 2-lane bridge left in place. They took out the middle part and left it on both sides, and it's now a fishing pier and a state park. It's called the Bill Burton Fishing Pier State Park, and it is named for a popular outdoor writer who died in 2009. Also on the river, at Horn Point, which is near Cambridge, is the headquarters of the Center for Environmental Sciences, which is a University of Maryland facility that does marine and bay research. A little further upstream on the Choptank is the Dover Bridge, where the river is the border between Talbot and Caroline County. And this is a swing bridge, and they had been trying to get the state to replace it, the local people, because first of all, it was too narrow for the amount of traffic it was taking. And when it swung open, it would tend to get stuck on hot days. Well, they finally, after a lot of lobbying, they did get a new bridge. And this is what the swing bridge looks like when it is open. The middle part swings out. But the old bridge is considered historic and it's being kept, but it's being kept in the open position that as you can see in this picture. So further upstream, it flows through Caroline County. And Caroline is the only Eastern Shore county that does not have any access to either the bay or the ocean. But Caroline County and the county seat, which is Denton, were important in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And as we heard, one of the governors came from Denton. That was Governor Hughes. And there was first the packet sailboat traffic, as we saw, and later steamboat traffic that went up and down the Choptank, connecting towns along it to other places on the Eastern Shore as well as Baltimore. And this is an old map from 1908. And I wish I could get, oh, here we go. Here's the cursor. Okay. So this is the river, and you can see all of the stops along the river. These are all the towns that the steamboat would stop at. And finally, it would come to Denton here. And this line here going across the map is the railroad. And you could take the steamboat to Denton and then change for the railroad to go possibly north to Philadelphia and points north. The river is no longer navigable all the way up to Denton. So Denton is now a quiet county seat. It's on the road to the Delaware beaches. And even that road now bypasses the town. The original name was Pig Point. I'm not sure why. They probably shipped a lot of pigs from there. Then it was changed to Edenton. It was named for Sir Robert Eden, who was the royal governor of Maryland. But during the Revolutionary War, the town decided to get rid of its British connection. So they just dropped the E and changed Edenton to Denton. And it's been Denton ever since. And I don't know if any of you have read James Michener's book, Chesapeake. I have not, but I understand that it is set at various locations along the Choptank River. So heading north, we come to the Tread Avon. And here's the river, and Oxford is on one side and Bellevue is on the other side. And as we've seen, there's a ferry. I think we've seen a picture. I will see a picture of the ferry a little further on. So in the late 17th century, this is very early in the settlement of Maryland by Europeans, the state legislature created Oxford and Annapolis as ports of entry for Maryland, and they would have port facilities and customs houses. Oxford became a port of entry in 1683, 23 years before Baltimore did. So these were important commercial areas at that point. It's on the Tread Avon, which is navigable, and it also has a deep water creek behind it, deep enough to be used for shipbuilding for ocean-going ships during the colonial times. During its heyday, Oxford had 6 boatyards. A London mercantile company sent Robert Morris to be its chief trader. And this is the Robert Morris Inn, which was his house. He made the company prosperous. They traded in tobacco, pelts, and general merchandise, but also slaves. His son, Robert Morris Jr., lived in Philadelphia and was one of the richest men in America, sometimes called the financier of the Revolution. And a class I took with John Dance, he called him the Warren Buffett of his day. Today, his house is the Robert Morris Inn, and Oxford is a very pretty town. And again, this is the Tread Avon ferry that crosses the Tread Avon. And it has been in continuous operation since 1836. It carries cars, trucks, passengers, bicycles, and sometimes school buses. The head of navigation on the Tread Avon is Easton, the county seat of Talbot County. And in November, they have a waterfowl festival. Among the activities include duck and goose calling contests. The Chester River, this is another big river, and it is the southern boundary of Kent County, which is bounded on the north by the Sassafras. And as you can see, rivers are often county boundaries. Millington was once the head of navigation, a former name of the town was Head of Chester. But Chestertown was laid out in 1706 as the official port of entry for Cecil, Kent, and Queen Anne's County. And this is approximately where Chestertown is on the river. And they had wealthy merchants who built mansions along the river. Many of them are still there. And they had an active social life. Horse racing, dances, theater, fox hunting, pursuits of a wealthy merchant class. They also had a tea party in May of 1774, the year after the Boston Tea Party. And they hold a reenactment every spring. But one writer investigating the numerous tea parties that followed the one in Boston says there's no hard evidence that Chestertown's actually ever happened. But that probably won't stop the town from reenacting it. So Chestertown today is an 18th century town, but it has a college, Washington College, a small liberal arts school, and it was named for George Washington. He gave the college permission to use his name, and he donated $233.33 for its endowment fund. And the college awarded him an honorary degree. One of the attractions in Chestertown is the schooner Sultana. It's a replica of an 18th century Boston-built merchant schooner, and they use it for educational programs for students. There's also an interesting connection between Chester and the Patapsco River. A dam that was removed from the Patapsco in 2011 was used to create an oyster reef at Swan Point near the mouth of the Chester, and they plant oyster spat on it. And they also have a river keeper. It's getting late. I'm gonna have to move along, so I'm gonna try and get through this as quickly as I can. This is the Corsica, which flows north into the Chester River. And it was originally Corsica Creek, but they named changed the name to the Corsica River by an act of the Maryland legislature. I couldn't find anything about why they wanted to do it. I guess river sounded more impressive. But this county seat of Queen Anne's County is not on the upper reaches. It's on the upper reaches, but not even on the Corsica. And it's not on any major river, but it was built there because it was central to the county. The original county seat was Queenstown, which is on the Chester, and it was a port, but they relocated it to Centerville, and Queenstown is now the home of a large shopping outlet, which you may have seen if you cross the Bay Bridge. The Sassafras River is the boundary between Kent and Cecil counties. It's very wide at its mouth. And it was one of the rivers explored by John Smith when he sailed up the Chesapeake. He named it the Tuckahoe for the Native American tribe that lived there. And possibly this is now Tuckahoe, which is another name for the sassafras plant. And now we're going to look at the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. This is a picture of it from its eastern end. It runs from the Elk River off the northern end of the bay to the Delaware River. And it crosses the Delmarva Peninsula at its narrowest point. This picture is taken in at the Delaware end. It's a major freight artery, and it cuts 340 miles off the trip for a ship going from Philadelphia or points north to Baltimore. It's one of the country's busiest waterways. It carries an estimated 25,000 ships a year and about 40% of the ship traffic to the port of Baltimore. It was originally built with locks, but it was re-engineered in the 20th century by the Army Corps of Engineers to be what's called a sea level canal. So it has no locks. They widened it and deepened it, and it is owned by the Corps of Engineers now. It was originally a private venture, as most canals were, dug by picks and shovels. But then eventually it fell on hard times and closed. And in the 20th century, the federal government bought it and re-engineered it. This is the C&D where it crosses, it goes through Chesapeake City in Cecil County, which is on both sides of the river. And this is how you have to build a bridge if you don't want to have a drawbridge that has to open when ships are passing through it. It's a very high bridge. And this is State Route 213 that goes over it. The Corps of Engineers recently built a trail along the north side of the canal, which is a recreational trail and heavily used. And finally, the Elk River in Cecil County is the northernmost river on the eastern shore. Possibly Northeast Creek could be considered another one, but the Elk is the biggest. And again, this is at the western end of the canal, and there's a state park, Elk Neck State Park, where the river meets the bay, and it has a swimming beach and a lighthouse, which you can see in this picture up on a bluff. It has a beautiful view of the bay, and the head of navigation on the Elk is Elkton, and it is also formerly head of Elk. And you may know Elkton was famous as the marriage town. It was the first train stop in Maryland heading south from New York and other points north. And Maryland didn't have a waiting period for a marriage license. So people who impulsively decided to get married would take the train to Elkton and get off. So that is the end of the Eastern Shore and its rivers. One of the major issues, pollution issues on the Eastern Shore is the runoff from chicken farms. They are a major sector of the agricultural economy. There is an estimate that 650 million pounds of chicken manure are produced every year in Maryland. And unless you treat it, it's going to run off into the rivers. The Pocomoke River has been especially impacted by this. At one point, the Waterkeeper Alliance sued the local grower and Purdue Farms, their contractor. Since the grounds were that since they were under contract to Purdue, that Purdue also had responsibility for the waste produced. But unfortunately, the judge threw it out for poor preparation on the part of the attorneys. So the problem of water pollution from agriculture is a big problem. It hasn't gone away yet, but I don't have time to go into it now. But, it is one of the Eastern Shore issues. So that is the Eastern Shore, and I'm going to see if there are any more questions. And then we will call it a day.
There is a, Judy, there is a comment from Michael Baker.
Okay.
He says, may I recommend Beautiful Swimmers, a book about the Eastern Shore, about the Chesapeake Bay, I believe.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's about the crab, the watermen.
The
and
crabs.
the crab
He
and-
said, sorry, I don't remember the author, but he was with the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
And I think it might have been Horton. Is there possibly by somebody named Horton? It's about the watermen of the Eastern Shore
Yeah.
by association.
Yeah,
of Horton's good work.
Tom Horton has written.
Tom Horton, okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful book.
No,
I have one of his books.
I'll look it up. I
And
have
take
it.
advantage of a wide choice of plans,
Yeah.
including an AARP Medicare Advantage plan from United Healthcare. It can combine your hospital and doctor coverage with Part
Someone
D
turn your radio off.
and more. All in one for a low.
It's not Tom Horton. It's somebody else. I'll look it up. and-
Okay, it's not, okay. And I also recommend Chesapeake by James Michener. It takes a
Oh.
long time to get through it, but it's a wonderful, wonderful book about the Eastern Shore. It
Okay.
really is.
Michael, did you want to say something?
Well, just on that canal and the Corps of Engineers, that falls under the purview of the Philadelphia district of the Corps of Engineers.
Okay.
It's in the Delaware River watershed.
Uh-huh.
And some years back, both my son and his wife were in the Corps of Engineers,
Oh,
and my daughter-in-law Gwen was commanding officer of the Philadelphia district.
oh, wow.
And she, I remember seeing a picture on her wall of her and Barbara Mikulski
Mhm.
and someone from Delaware, one of the senators. It wasn't Joe Biden, but she was responsible for that
Wow.
building that bike trail.
Oh, okay.
As
Wow.
a matter of fact, yeah. So that was one of her little
Thank
little
you.
gold stars that she got for her service up there.
Very nice. Before we get off, I just wanted to share something that Swaran had sent me. There's a quote from the Hindu epics that says, "Rivers are daughters of the mountains," which I thought was nice. Oh, Babette has a question. Before we get off.
No, I think it's
Warner.
Warner who wrote the book.
It is.
Yeah.
William
William
Warner.
W.
Yes.
Warner.
William Warner. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an
Okay.
absolutely beautiful book. It's
It is a very lovely
oh
book.
my God, it is great. Lester Lee and the chicken neckers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all. And next week, we'll be looking at the rivers of Baltimore City and County, local.
Oh, good.
Oh, great. Thank you. Great class,
Thanks,
Judy.
Judy.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much,
Thank you,
Judy.
Judy.
Bye.
Judy, thank you very much.
Thank you. Love the
Thank you.
class.
Bye.
Yeah, great.
Now, how do I get out here? I'm looking for the end the class. Oh, here. Okay, got it. See you later. See you next.
All right.